Close your eyes. You're standing in a world before history, before buildings, before clocks, before even the idea of time. The air feels heavier here, raw and alive, filled with the smell of grass, smoke, and rain. The horizon stretches forever, painted with forests and rivers untouched by human hands. There's no noise, no city hum, just wind, insects, and the distant crackle of a campfire somewhere in the dark. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them, so subscribe maybe. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I check comments, and it's like New York after midnight, Manila at sunrise, London just before bed, all tuning in to the same story at once. Because tonight, we're going back. Back to when humanity was still young, when we wandered barefoot across a living planet, guided by the stars and the seasons. This is where the story of us truly begins, the age of the hunter-gatherers. 200,000 years ago, the world was raw, untamed, and mercilessly alive. The continents were already drifting toward the shapes we know today. But nothing about the earth then felt familiar. Great deserts stretched across Africa. Glaciers crept down from the poles, swallowing valleys and carving mountains into silence. Between them, vast savannas shimmered under a restless sun, where herds of antelope, elephants, and giant buffalo grazed beside predators that watched from the tall grass. It was a world balanced on the knife edge of climate, where the rhythm of life was dictated by rain, drought, and ice. This was the stage on which our story began. Long before cities, before writing, before even the idea of history, small bands of early humans moved through this landscape, fragile, clever, and unknown. The species we call Homo sapiens had just begun to appear, evolving from older ancestors who had already spent millions of years learning how to walk upright, use tools, and survive. But these new humans were different. Their bodies looked almost identical to ours, but inside their skulls, something extraordinary was happening. Their minds were changing. The climate's chaos was their teacher. As the Ice Age tightened its grip, resources vanished without warning. Rivers shifted, forests withered, and entire species disappeared. To endure, these early humans had to adapt faster than any creature before them. They learned to cooperate, to share food, to plan beyond the next sunrise. They began to see not just the world as it was, but what it could become. That single difference, the ability to imagine, would change everything. Africa's Great Rift Valley became humanity's crucible. It was a land of contrasts, lush valleys shadowed by volcanic peaks, where drought and flood followed each other like breath. Here, fire flickered in caves where families huddled for warmth, and stone flakes struck from rock became the first whispers of technology. Each spark, each cut of obsidian, was a declaration of survival. Across the plains, other human species walked the earth too. Neanderthals in the cold north, Denisovans in the east, and perhaps others now lost to time. But only one lineage carried the spark that would outlast them all. By chance, by intelligence, or by sheer adaptability, Homo sapiens would soon step beyond this cradle and begin reshaping the planet. The earth they inherited was beautiful but brutal. Every sunrise was uncertain, every breath a gamble. Yet, amid the roar of wind and the silence of stars, the first humans learned to endure, and in doing so, they began to dream. Their story was just beginning, written not in words or ink, but in footprints across a trembling earth. Somewhere along the Great Rift Valley, beneath a sky painted in dust and fire, the first true humans took their first uncertain steps into history. It was a landscape both harsh and magnificent, volcanoes steaming in the distance, rivers carving their silver paths through savanna and scrub, herds of antelope thundering across the horizon. Here, Amid the rhythm of drought and monsoon, Homo sapiens was born. They were not alone. Across Africa and beyond it, other human species were thriving. Homo erectus, long adapted to endurance and fire, the robust Homo heidelbergensis, and far to the north, the powerful Neanderthals. But something about the beings emerging from East Africa was different. They carried within them a quiet revolution, one that would never appear in bone or fossil, but in thought. It began not in muscle or tooth, but in the mind. What set them apart was not strength, but imagination. They began to see beyond the present moment, to remember, to plan, to dream. Around their campfires, they learned to communicate with gestures, tones, and symbols, turning noise into language. They taught one another not only what to do, but why. For the first time, ideas could travel farther than footsteps. Empathy followed. They began to care for their injured, to feed the weak, to bury their dead. These simple acts changed everything. Cooperation became survival's greatest tool, binding families into tribes, tribes into communities. This ability to share emotion, to understand the pain and hope of another being, forged a power greater than claws or fangs, the power to unite. Over generations, their curiosity grew. They experimented with fire, crafted sharper tools, and began to decorate their bodies with pigment and beads. A sense of self was forming, an awareness that the world could be shaped and that they had the will to shape it. Every innovation was fragile, fleeting, but together they became the first notes of civilization's long song. The Rift Valley became more than a birthplace. It was humanity's first classroom. Every challenge, it offered hunger, flood, heat, and cold, taught lessons that would echo through every generation to come. When the climate shifted once again, and green lands turned to dust, small groups began to move outward, chasing rain, animals, and hope. From these wanderers came us. Every person alive today carries their echo, the same curiosity, the same empathy, the same spark that first burned beneath an African sky. It was here that our species learned not just to survive, but to imagine a world that could be more than it was. And from that imagination, everything else would follow. For millions of years, the night belonged to other creatures. Eyes glowed from the brush, fangs gleamed in moonlight, and for early humans, darkness meant danger. But then came the moment that changed everything, the moment we learned to hold a piece of the sun in our hands. Fire. It didn't just warm the cold or chase away predators, it transformed what it meant to be human. No one knows exactly when that first spark was captured. Perhaps lightning struck a dry tree, or volcanic embers rolled down a slope into waiting hands. However it happened, fire became our first true ally. Its discovery was both a miracle and a turning point. A technology so powerful it would reshape not only the body, but the mind. Around those early flames, life as we know it began. The gift of heat meant safety. The long, freezing nights that once kept humans huddled in fear became hours of warmth and gathering. Fire hardened wooden spears, cooked meat to make it easier to digest, and warded off the wild. It gave energy where before there had been exhaustion, light where there had been endless dark. But its influence went deeper than survival. For the first time, humans had control over time itself. The day no longer ended with the sunset. Under the orange glow, faces could be seen, voices could rise, and thoughts could stretch into the hours once ruled by silence. The firelight became the world's first stage, and in its flicker, the first stories were born. Those early storytellers might have spoken of the hunt, of spirits in the stars, or the memory of thunder. As flames danced across stone walls and shifting shadows took the shapes of animals, imagination awoke. Storytelling bound tribes together. It preserved knowledge, passed warnings, and planted the seeds of belief. Fire had not only changed how humans ate and slept, it had changed how they thought. The control of fire also reshaped the human body. Cooked food meant more energy, more nutrition, and smaller jaws. Over generations, brains grew larger, and with that growth came complexity, emotion, creativity, curiosity. Fire was no longer just a tool. It was a symbol, a teacher, a mirror of life itself. As sparks rose into the night sky, so too did the human spirit. The fear of darkness faded, replaced by wonder. Every campfire became a tiny universe of warmth and meaning in an endless wilderness. And in those glowing circles of light, humanity learned its first great lesson that together, beneath the stars, they could create their own sun. Long before words were spoken, meaning already flowed between early humans. A raised hand, a shift in posture, the rhythm of footsteps, all were signals in a world that demanded constant awareness. Communication began not with sentences, but with instinct. A glance could warn of danger. A cry could summon help. A gesture could share a thought too complex for survival alone. In this silent language, the first threads of understanding were woven. But over time, something remarkable began to happen. The human mind was growing restless. It was no longer satisfied with pointing and shouting. It began to crave expression not just of fear or hunger, but of curiosity, memory, and wonder. Across Africa's plains and river valleys, communication evolved from reflex into art. The grunts and hums that once echoed through the air started to follow rhythm, pattern, and intention. Scientists believe this shift was gradual, unfolding over tens of thousands of years. The vocal cords refined, the tongue became agile, and the brain's wiring, especially in regions tied to speech and comprehension, expanded. What began as mere calls for survival transformed into conversation. Humans were beginning to talk. With words came planning, coordination, and a shared sense of time. No longer limited to reacting, they could now imagine futures and recall pasts. Language changed everything. It was more than a way to name the world. It became a tool for reshaping it. With words, humans could organize hunts, teach tool-making, comfort the grieving, and tell stories that bridged generations. Knowledge was no longer locked within one mind. It could travel, evolve, and endure. A lesson learned by one person could ripple outward through an entire tribe, then onward to descendants yet unborn. And then came imagination. Words gave form to the invisible. They allowed humans to dream aloud, to invent spirits, to describe the unseen forces of wind and flame, to create meaning in mystery. Around the campfire, these new sounds became the roots of myth and memory. Every story told was an act of preservation, a way to make sense of a vast, unpredictable world. The ability to speak also reshaped the human spirit. Language was the bridge between thought and empathy, allowing people to share emotion, to feel another's joy or sorrow. In this communion of sound, humanity found its voice not just in the throat, but in the heart. Words became sharper than stone, lighter than flame, and stronger than time. They were our first true invention, the foundation of everything that would follow. And through them, thought itself learned how to live beyond the mind that dreamed it. The world of the early hunter was vast, open, and mercilessly alive. Across the endless grasslands of Africa, the horizon shimmered beneath the heat of a sun that spared nothing. Herds of wildebeest, antelope, and zebra thundered across plains that stretched farther than sight could follow. To survive here, humans had to become something new, creatures not of claw or speed, but of patience, memory, and mind. Every movement was a calculation. The wind carried stories, the faint musk of a herd, the scent of lions, the dry tang of dust disturbed by hooves. The ground itself became a map, each print, each broken blade of grass, a sentence in the language of survival. Early humans learned to read that language fluently. They could tell how long ago an animal had passed, whether it was limping, whether it was resting, or fleeing. This knowledge was their weapon, sharper than any spear they carried. But it wasn't strength alone that made them dangerous, it was unity. No creature hunted quite like humans. Lions and wolves relied on instinct. Humans relied on strategy. They began to move as one, silent and coordinated, anticipating one another's actions. Some drove prey forward, others lay in wait, all guided by invisible signals and shared understanding. In this cooperation, humanity found its first taste of mastery over the wild. Persistence became their edge. While faster predators relied on bursts of power, humans turned endurance into an art. They could chase an antelope for hours, even days, using the heat of the sun to their advantage. The prey would sprint and tire. The hunters would walk and wait. When at last the animal collapsed from exhaustion, the hunters stood triumphant, not because they were stronger, but because they had learned patience. The hunt was more than survival. It was ritual, rhythm, and communion. Each successful pursuit fed not only the body but the bond between those who shared it. Around the carcass, the tribe celebrated with gratitude. Fire roasted the meat, language shared the story, and knowledge passed to those too young to hunt. In this cycle, hunting became identity, the heartbeat of early humanity. Through the hunt, humans began to understand the world's balance. They saw themselves reflected in the creatures they pursued, both part of nature and apart from it. Every chase was a lesson in respect, every kill a reminder of fragility. In mastering the open world, they were also mastering themselves. The savannah was no longer just a place of danger. It had become their proving ground, their teacher, and their first great kingdom. For every hunter scanning the horizon, there was a gatherer kneeling close to the earth. Theirs was a quieter mastery, one built not on pursuit but on patience, not on strength but on memory. While hunters followed herds across the plains, gatherers followed seasons, tracing invisible routes through forests, riverbanks, and meadows. To them, the land was a living map, one that could feed or kill depending on how well it was read. Every plant, every root, every fruit told a story. A green shoot meant nourishment. Another could mean poison. Berries that gleamed too brightly were avoided. Those dulled by dust and sun were prized. The bark of certain trees held medicine, while the sap of others could burn the skin. To gatherers, these details were not chance, they were knowledge passed through generations like sacred text. Long before writing, this wisdom traveled through song and memory. Mothers taught daughters the taste of edible seeds. Elders spoke of which tubers could be eaten raw and which needed fire. The forest became a library, and every leaf a page. With each passing generation, that library grew richer, turning survival into science. Gatherers also understood time in a way hunters did not. They marked the calendar through change, the first blossoms of spring, the migration of bees, the ripening of figs. These signs told them when to move, when to stay, and when danger was near. Their knowledge wasn't written in symbols or stone, but in rhythm. To live was to listen to the hum of insects, the song of birds, the subtle whisper of wind through grass. And yet their work did more than feed the tribe. It shaped human society. While hunters returned with bursts of meat and triumph, gatherers provided constancy. Their baskets carried nuts, grains, and roots that sustained life between hunts. They were the keepers of continuity, the unseen backbone of survival. In their hands lay not just food, but medicine, fabric, and fire fuel. Through them, the wild was tamed, not conquered, but understood. In every climate and continent, the gatherer's knowledge guided humanity's first steps toward civilization. The first farmers would later build on their legacy, but it was the gatherers who laid its foundation. They taught humans to see patterns in nature, to recognize cycles, to predict what would come next. Their world was one of quiet brilliance. They read landscapes like constellations, their minds filled with maps no parchment could hold. While hunters brought back the thrill of the chase, gatherers brought back the memory of the earth itself, a knowledge written not in ink, but in the soil beneath their feet. The story of human progress is not written in words or monuments. It is written in stone. Long before iron or bronze, before cities or kings, humanity's first inventions lay scattered across the ground, small, sharp fragments shaped by persistence and need. These tools were crude at first, simple flakes chipped from rock. Yet within them burned the spark of everything that would follow. It began with observation. A rock cracked in two revealed an edge that could cut. A broken bone splintered into a point that could pierce. Early humans learned to look at the world not as it was, but as it could be shaped. With each strike of stone against stone, they began to master precision. A single flake, removed in the right place, could mean the difference between survival and failure. Over thousands of years, the tools grew more refined. Scrapers emerged to clean hides, turning animal skin into clothing and shelter. Sharp blades carved meat and sinew, while heavy hand axes split bone to reach the rich marrow inside. Spears tipped with stone allowed hunters to strike from a distance, transforming fear into confidence. Every improvement was hard-won, born not from sudden genius, but from endless trial. Patience became the ancestor of progress. A single new technique could take generations to perfect and spread. Yet every tool carried with it an idea, a whisper of foresight, a promise of what could be done better. The people who shaped these stones were not just surviving, they were thinking ahead. Innovation, in its purest form, had begun. Bones joined stone as raw material for invention. The remains of hunted animals became awls, needles, and fishhooks. Antlers turned into handles, tusks into ornaments. Nature's leftovers became extensions of the human hand, merging creativity with necessity. In every object crafted, there was intention. It was no longer enough to use what was found. Humans began to design what they needed. The making of tools changed more than survival, it changed the mind itself. The act of shaping stone required imagination, planning, and memory. It demanded the ability to see an outcome before it existed. Each chipped edge was a thought made visible. By the time the first blades gleamed beneath the sun, humanity had crossed an invisible line. The earth was no longer just home, it had become a workshop. Every flake of stone struck from its core was a declaration that humans could alter the world around them. These were not mere tools. They were the first signs of civilization, born from patience, endurance, and the quiet brilliance of human hands. For early humans, the world was never still. It moved with the seasons, breathed with the rains, and shifted beneath the changing sky. To live was to follow, to walk with the rhythm of the earth itself. They were nomads, travelers without borders, carrying their lives not in possessions, but in memory. Every journey was a return, every migration a lesson, repeated through generations. As the dry season stripped the rivers to dust, families gathered what they could and began to move. They followed the faint promise of water, the trails of migrating herds, and the ancient paths carved by ancestors long before names were spoken. The land was both map and companion, a living presence that provided when respected and punished when ignored. They knew where the roots grew thickest, where the berries ripened, where the wind carried the scent of rain. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was permanent. Their homes were made of what nature offered: branches, hides, grass, and clay, built to rise and vanish with the passing months. When the seasons shifted, they left without hesitation. their footprints fading into the soil. To stay too long was to risk death. The land demanded movement, and they obeyed. Yet in that motion lay freedom, a balance between endurance and belonging. They owned nothing, yet everything they needed belonged to them through understanding. Every return to a familiar valley or watering hole carried echoes of the past. Stones once used to grind seeds were still there, worn smooth by generations of hands. The scent of smoke lingered in places where fires had burned seasons before. For the nomads, time itself was circular. The same constellations that guided their ancestors still marked the path across the sky. Their stories passed from mouth to mouth beside the flames. Movement shaped their bodies and their minds. Children grew strong, walking long distances. Elders carried the tribe's history and memory. The horizon was both boundary and invitation. To follow it was to trust that the world would provide, that rivers would fill again, that herds would return. Theirs was a faith not in gods, but in the earth's unbroken rhythm. In this endless migration, humans learned resilience and adaptability. They became attuned to change itself, mastering the art of survival through motion. Each journey was a bridge between the known and the unknown. And though they built no cities, left no monuments, their legacy remains etched in the trails they walked, the invisible roads that connected mountains, valleys, and time itself. Before there were cities, before the first fields of grain, there was craft. The art of making was the quiet revolution that reshaped humanity from mere survivors into creators. Every object, every needle, basket, hide, and carving was born not from chance, but from patience, observation, and imagination. To make something with one's hands was to transform nature into meaning, to turn survival into expression. On the edges of rivers and plains, early humans learned to tan animal hides. The process was slow, meticulous, and essential. Raw skin stiffened and rotted quickly, but through soaking, scraping, and stretching, it became soft and enduring. From this came clothing and shelter, the first defenses against the extremes of heat and cold. The smell of smoke and fat filled the air as hides were smoked over fire, infused with resilience. It was a primitive chemistry, born from experimentation and memory. Fibers became the next medium of transformation. Plant stems, stripped and twisted, turned into cordage threads that bound the world together. From these threads came baskets, nets, and ropes, each woven with knowledge passed down through generations. A single basket could take days to complete, each pattern a signature of its maker, each weave a reflection of local resources and environment. These objects weren't just tools. They were extensions of identity, of belonging. Bones and ivory were carved into awls and needles, allowing humans to sew clothing tight against their skin. Antlers were shaped into handles and hooks. From the earth, clay was molded into small figures, symbols of fertility, life, and hope. For the first time, hands were shaping things not only for need, but for beauty. Art and utility had begun to merge. Decoration emerged naturally from creation. As people crafted tools, they adorned them. Beads made from shells, teeth, and seeds were strung around necks. Pigments of ochre and charcoal stained skin and stone alike. These gestures were more than vanity. They were communication. They told stories of tribe, of spirit, of memory. In a world without words, the act of making became its own language. The art of making also changed how humans saw themselves. It required planning, cooperation, and foresight. To weave a basket was to think ahead. To carve a spearhead was to imagine the hunt. Each creation carried a piece of thought, a trace of imagination made tangible. These humble crafts laid the foundation for engineering, architecture, and art. The world of the gatherer and hunter was no longer just a struggle against nature, it was a collaboration with it. Bones, fibers, hides, and pigments became the vocabulary of human creativity. Through craft, early humans learned something profound, that with time, patience, and care, the world could be reshaped by their own hands. Every stitch, every carving, every woven strand was a quiet act of defiance against impermanence, a promise that even in a fleeting world, creation could outlast its maker. It began with footsteps soft, cautious, and uncertain, leaving behind the cradle of humanity for the first time. From the savannas of East Africa, small bands of Homo sapiens followed rivers northward, coastlines eastward, and the fading scent of rain across the horizon. They didn't know they were leaving the birthplace of humankind. They were simply chasing survival, following herds, water, and warmth. Yet in those journeys lay the greatest migration story in Earth's history. The landscape they faced was merciless and breathtaking. Volcanoes rose like blackened towers. The air shimmered with heat by day and froze by night. Droughts turned forests into deserts, and shifting winds erased familiar trails. To move across this world required more than endurance, it demanded imagination. Every crossing was a leap of faith, every new land an unknown filled with both danger and promise. The route out of Africa wound through narrow corridors of land and sea. Some followed the Red Sea coast into Arabia, hugging the shorelines where fish and shellfish offered food. Others pushed inland toward the Sinai and the Levant, where green valleys cut through the desert. They walked in small groups, rarely more than a few dozen, carrying fire, tools, and stories. These weren't conquerors or explorers as we think of them now. They were wanderers, drawn forward by necessity. As they spread, they encountered worlds beyond imagining. To the east, monsoon forests and tropical coasts. To the north, icy plains ruled by mammoths and cave bears. To reach them, humans adapted with astonishing speed. They crafted new clothing, shaped better spears, and learned to build shelters that held back the cold. In each new environment, they reinvented themselves. Reaching Asia required patience measured in generations. The descendants of those first migrants crossed into the Indian subcontinent, through jungles alive with tigers and elephants. Others followed the coastline into Southeast Asia, eventually reaching the islands of Indonesia and beyond. They became mariners long before history recorded it, building rafts and primitive boats to cross channels that no other species had dared. By the time glaciers locked the northern world, humans had already walked from Africa to the edge of Australia. Europe was another kind of trial, a land of ice and predators, where survival meant facing winters that never truly ended. There, humans met the Neanderthals, strong and intelligent cousins who had thrived in the cold for thousands of years. Some competed with them. Others shared knowledge and, as modern genetics now reveals, even blood. Humanity was not a single thread, but a tapestry woven from many lineages, bound by shared endurance. Each migration reshaped both the people and the planet. Fire spread to new forests. The bones of prey and the prints of feet appeared in caves where no human had walked before. Mountains became boundaries, rivers became roads, and stars became guides. The world that had once seemed endless was slowly being mapped by memory and myth. The great journey out of Africa was more than a movement across land. It was the awakening of a species that refused to stay still. Every step carried the echo of survival, curiosity, and hope. In their footprints, across deserts and oceans, lay the first proof of what it truly meant to be human, not just to live in the world, but to cross it. The world had frozen over. Mountains disappeared beneath sheets of ice. Valleys turned to tundra, and the air itself seemed to burn with cold. The Ice Age had gripped the planet in silence, sculpting continents with glaciers miles thick. Rivers slowed to trickles beneath frost, and the horizon shimmered with snow that never melted. For those who lived through it, the Earth was both enemy and home, a landscape of extremes that demanded brilliance just to survive. Across the vast plains of Eurasia, herds of mammoth, bison, and reindeer moved like living storms. Their migrations were the pulse of the frozen world, dictating the rhythm of human existence. To follow them meant life. To lose them meant death. Hunters watched the horizon for hours, waiting for the faint tremor of distant hooves. Every pursuit was a battle of endurance. The cold tested more than strength, it tested imagination. Clothing became armor against the elements. Layers of fur and hide stitched with bone needles formed a barrier between life and frostbite. Shelters were carved from snowdrifts, built from mammoth bones, or dug deep into frozen soil. In this age of ice, every breath, every heartbeat, was a negotiation with the planet itself. Yet within this hardship, something extraordinary began to unfold. Humans discovered not only how to survive, but how to create. In the dim glow of their fires, deep inside caves hidden from the wind, they began to paint. Walls of limestone became canvases. With pigments ground from ochre, charcoal, and iron, they captured the world around them: the curve of a bison's back, the rush of galloping horses, the flash of mammoth tusks in the snow. These were not crude scrawls of instinct. They were deliberate, elegant, alive. The artists used the rock's natural contours to give depth and motion, turning stone into living story. The caves of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira would one day be rediscovered thousands of generations later, still glowing with color. To the people who made them, these images were more than decoration, they were memory, ritual, perhaps even prayer. Through art, humans began to preserve moments that might otherwise vanish. It was a way to defy the impermanence of life in a world of ice. Music and rhythm followed. Hollow bones turned into flutes. Stones struck together echoed through the night. The Ice Age may have hardened the land, but it awakened the soul. Communities formed around shared creation, not just shared survival. The human spirit had found a voice that the cold could not silence. Beneath the aurora-lit skies, the first traces of culture burned brighter than any fire. In the face of extinction, humanity learned something profound. Survival alone was not enough. To truly endure, they needed to remember, to imagine, and to express. On the edge of ice, where life hung by a thread, humans became more than creatures of the earth. They became storytellers, dreamers, artists, and through that, immortal. Deep beneath the surface of the earth, where light rarely reached and silence pressed like a living thing, early humans began to paint. Their footsteps echoed through narrow tunnels, torches hissed against stone, and the scent of smoke mingled with earth and pigment. The walls before them were more than rock, they were the first canvases of the human mind. Inside these caves, art was born, and with it, the beginnings of memory, faith, and imagination. The scenes they created were breathtaking. Herds of bison thundered across walls that seemed to move in the glow of flame. Horses galloped in graceful arcs, their flanks marked with lines of motion. Mammoths loomed, woolly and immense, their tusks curling toward the ceiling, and among them, small, haunting details, handprints, dozens of them. Negative impressions, made by pressing a palm against the wall and blowing pigment through a hollow reed. Those hands are still there, 40,000 years later, as if their makers reached across time to remind us that they once existed, that they too felt wonder and fear. These paintings were not idle decoration. Each stroke carried purpose. Some may have marked a hunt, a story retold to teach and remember. Others may have been offerings to unseen powers, an attempt to speak to nature through image and symbol. Whatever their reason, these artists were doing something no creature had done before. They were imagining what was not immediately in front of them and preserving it for those who would come after. The pigments themselves reveal their sophistication. Iron oxide, manganese, and charcoal were ground into fine powder, mixed with fat or water to create lasting color. They understood how to layer shades for depth, how to use the contours of the stone to give motion and life. In the flicker of firelight, these animals seemed to breathe. Art and illusion were born together. These caves, Chauvet in France, Altamira in Spain, Sulawesi in Indonesia, were humanity's first cathedrals. Their walls became a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Inside the darkness, humans found something larger than survival. Connection. Connection to each other, to the animals they hunted, to the invisible forces that shaped their world. The act of painting itself may have been a ritual, a form of meditation, a way to enter a trance where imagination and reality blurred. Every handprint tells a story not of individuals, but of a shared awakening. These were people who had begun to understand permanence, to realize that ideas could outlive flesh. The painted caves were humanity's first libraries, the earliest record of consciousness asserting itself against time. In those hidden chambers, surrounded by the echoes of dripping water and flickering fire, humans took their first steps toward culture, toward religion, toward story. The walls of stone became mirrors for the soul, reflecting a truth that still defines us today. That even when the world outside is cold, dark, and uncertain, the light of imagination burns endlessly within. Somewhere in the deep past, humanity did something no other creature had ever done. They began to care for their dead. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible change, but one that reshaped the human soul. What began as a simple act of protection, covering a fallen body with earth or stone to keep scavengers away, slowly transformed into something sacred. From that moment forward, humans were no longer just living beings. They had become conscious of mortality. Archaeological traces mark this awakening. In the caves of Shanidar in Iraq, flowers were placed beside the bodies of the dead. Their pollen still lingers in the soil after tens of thousands of years, suggesting not accident, but intention. In the rolling hills of Israel's Mount Carmel, ochre stains mark where ancient hands sprinkled red pigment over the deceased, a color that symbolized life, blood, and renewal. These were not the actions of creatures bound only to instinct. They were gestures of reverence, expressions of grief and wonder. Death had become more than an ending. It had become a mystery. By honoring the dead, humans were acknowledging something unseen, an idea that life might continue beyond the final breath. The buried were given tools, shells, and ornaments, perhaps to accompany them into another world. The act of burial itself became a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between the living and the departed. In those early moments of mourning, the seeds of religion and philosophy were sown. Humans began to see the world as more than what the eye could perceive. The landscape of the spirit opened up unmapped, invisible, but profoundly real. Around fires, whispers of ancestors began to form, stories of spirits that watched over the living, guiding or warning them. The dead were no longer gone. They had become part of the tribe's memory, its collective heartbeat. The use of ochre became universal. Across continents and millennia, from Africa to Europe to Australia, the same red powder appeared beside bones and skulls. It was as if distant peoples who had never met shared the same instinct to color the body with the essence of life before it returned to the earth. Flowers, beads, carved tools, all tokens of remembrance, spoke of love and connection that transcended death. Through this reverence, the human mind crossed an invisible threshold. Compassion extended beyond the living. The act of caring for the dead reflected empathy, foresight, and imagination, the very traits that defined our species. Burial transformed fear into meaning and loss into legacy. In the stillness of those ancient graves lies the earliest evidence of humanity's soul. It tells us that, even in a world ruled by cold, hunger, and survival, humans found time to honor, to hope, and to believe. The earth became both cradle and tomb, holding not just the body, but the promise of something eternal. And from that soil of remembrance, the human spirit began to rise. Long before civilization, before nations, or borders, or names, there was the tribe. A small circle of people bound not by blood alone, but by survival. In a world that demanded cooperation for every breath, unity was strength, and community was life. Across plains, forests, and icy tundras, the tribe was humanity's first true invention. A social structure born not of power, but of necessity. A single human, alone, could not endure for long. The predators were faster, the winters colder, the nights filled with unseen danger. But together, they became something extraordinary. Dozens of minds thinking as one. Dozens of hands working toward a single purpose. In that shared effort lay the secret to humanity's rise. Cooperation was the invisible force that lifted the species from the edge of extinction to mastery over the world. Every tribe was a living network of skill and memory. Hunters knew the movement of herds and the shape of tracks in the mud. Gatherers remembered which roots healed and which poisoned. Elders carried the stories of the seasons and the wisdom of storms. Children watched, listened, and learned. Each person's knowledge became the group's survival. It was an early form of civilization, fluid, egalitarian, and profoundly interdependent. Leadership was earned, not inherited. Those who guided the tribe were chosen for their wisdom and generosity, not their dominance. Decisions were made through conversation, debate, and consensus around the fire. The tribe understood something many societies would later forget. Strength did not come from one ruling over many, but from many moving as one. Shared responsibility extended beyond the hunt. Child-rearing was communal. Every adult watched over every child, ensuring the next generation carried the group's collective memory. Infants passed from arm to arm, nurtured by a community that saw no division between yours and mine. This cooperation wasn't merely emotional, it was biological. Human infants were born helpless, demanding care far beyond that of other animals. Without the tribe, they could not survive. Food, too, was shared. A successful hunt meant a feast for all, not wealth for a few. Those unable to hunt the sick, the elderly were still fed, for their knowledge and experience were priceless. In a harsh and unpredictable world, generosity was not charity, it was insurance. It was the understanding that tomorrow's survivor might be today's giver. Through cooperation, early humans built trust, empathy, and identity. The tribe became the mirror in which people saw themselves, not as individuals, but as part of something greater. Within this unity grew laughter, love, and loyalty, emotions that strengthened bonds far more than fear or dominance ever could. In time, this sense of belonging would echo across every form of human society. It would build villages, forge armies, create nations, and inspire religions. But it began here, in the circle of the tribe, where survival depended on the willingness to stand together. It was in these early communities that humanity discovered its most enduring truth. Alone, we are fragile, but together, we are infinite. For tens of thousands of years, the survival of humanity rested not only on the spear, but on the memory of women. They were the keepers of rhythm, the guardians of continuity, and the quiet architects of culture. While the men hunted and roamed, it was the women who mapped the land with their minds, remembering the seasons, the plants, and the paths of water. They were the mothers of memory, ensuring that the fragile thread of human knowledge was never broken. Their world was one of deep observation. A gatherer could look across a valley and read its life story, the shape of the leaves, the flight of birds, the smell of soil after rain. They knew when the roots were sweetest, when berries turned from poison to food, when insects swarmed to warn of coming storms. Each plant carried a name, a use, a danger. This wisdom was not written, yet it endured through repetition and storytelling, passed from mouth to mouth, mother to child, generation to generation. Women were also healers, the first scientists of the living world. They learned which herbs eased pain, which bark stopped bleeding, which smoke kept illness away. They ground leaves into poultices and mixed resins into salves, turning nature into medicine through trial and patience. In their hands, the line between care and ceremony blurred. Healing was not only physical, it was spiritual, a gesture that bound the tribe in compassion. Around the fires at night, their voices carried the oldest stories. They told of ancestors and animals, of spirits that guarded rivers and mountains. Through these tales, they taught morality, memory, and belonging. Storytelling was their tool of education, shaping young minds long before writing ever existed. In these oral traditions, time folded yesterday and tomorrow, meeting in the same spoken breath. As navigators, women marked the turning of the stars and the changes of the moon. They knew when tides would rise, when rains would fall, and when the herds would move. Their understanding of cycles became the foundation of early calendars, guiding migrations, hunts, and harvests. To know the pattern of the earth was to survive it, and they knew it better than anyone. Even in art, their hands left quiet traces. Beads, necklaces, and painted figures found in ancient burials bear the mark of feminine craft. These were not decorations of vanity, but symbols of continuity, fertility, and reverence for life itself. Through beauty, they preserved identity. Through patience, they created permanence. Theirs was not a power of dominance, but of connection, a web of knowledge that held humanity together when the world was wild and uncertain. They nurtured, taught, remembered, and healed. In doing so, they carried the weight of civilization before civilization had a name. The mothers of memory did more than give life, they gave meaning to it. And though their voices have faded into prehistory, their knowledge lives on in the stories we tell, the medicines we use, and the instinct we still feel to protect, to teach, and to remember. Before classrooms, before rules and written words, there was the wild and open world, where children learned by living. Childhood in the prehistoric age was not a separate phase of life. It was woven into the fabric of survival itself. Every day was a lesson, every sound, scent, and shadow a teacher. The first children grew up beneath wide skies and ancient trees, their world both perilous and full of wonder. In their laughter, play, and curiosity lay the seeds of humanity's most remarkable gift, the ability to learn without being taught. Play was their first form of education. It began with imitation, the mimicry of movement, gesture, and rhythm. A child watched an elder strike flint and copied the motion with pebbles. They pretended to stalk prey, throw spears, or weave grasses, not out of instruction but instinct. Through games of chase, climbing, and wrestling, their bodies grew strong, their reflexes sharp. Each playful act rehearsed the skills they would one day need to survive. Nature was both their playground and their classroom. Curiosity was their greatest tool. The children of the wild asked questions not with words, but with their senses. They touched, tasted, and tested everything around them. They watched insects burrow, animals hunt, and fire dance. Through exploration, they discovered cause and effect, risk and reward. This relentless curiosity was not just a quirk of youth, it was evolution's masterpiece. The drive to explore and experiment ensured that every new generation carried the potential for innovation. Their education came not from lectures but from living examples. The tribe was their teacher. They listened to the stories told at night, absorbing lessons hidden in myth and song. They learned empathy through shared laughter and shared struggle. Cooperation, patience, and courage were not abstract values. They were skills practiced daily. When danger appeared, they learned from how the adults responded, when to fight, when to flee, when to stay silent. The bond between generations was powerful. Elders passed on wisdom, not through command, but through demonstration. Children observed everything: the way food was prepared, the way tools were shaped, the way wounds were treated. Learning was continuous, unstructured, and holistic. It wove together art, science, and survival long before those words existed. Yet, amid hardship, there was joy. Fossilized footprints found beside rivers show small tracks running and circling larger ones, evidence of play. Tiny handprints painted on cave walls tell us they were part of the human story from the beginning. They were not burdens but symbols of hope, living reminders that the future was worth fighting for. The childhood of early humans was brief but profound. By adolescence, they were already contributors to the tribe, skilled and self-reliant. Yet the traits they developed as children, curiosity, playfulness, adaptability, never left them. They became the foundation of human creativity and intelligence. In those wild, untamed years, humanity learned its most enduring lesson: that to play is to learn, and to wonder is to evolve. The children of the wild were not just the heirs of survival, they were the architects of imagination, shaping a future their parents could scarcely dream of. Long before temples rose or doctors existed, healing began in the firelight. It was born not from science as we know it, but from wonder, from the deep human desire to understand suffering and to soothe it. In the earliest tribes, when sickness struck or pain spread through the camp, the people turned to those who could listen to the rhythms of nature and the whispers of the unseen. These were the healers and the dreamwalkers, the first physicians, the first philosophers, and the first poets of the human spirit. Their knowledge came from observation. They watched animals seek certain leaves after being wounded, or chew bitter roots when fevered. They tasted bark and sap, learning which burned the tongue and which calmed the body. Trial and memory shaped their wisdom, and over generations, they built the first pharmacopoeia of the world. Willow bark to ease pain, mint to settle the stomach, honey to cleanse wounds. Nature offered medicine freely, but only to those patient enough to learn its language. Yet healing in those times was never only about the body. Illness was seen as a disturbance in the balance between the human and the natural, the visible and the invisible. The healer's role was not just to cure but to restore harmony. They used song and chant to steady the breath, rhythm to focus the mind, and trance to reach a place beyond waking thought. In those altered states, they sought guidance from ancestors, from spirits, from forces that the tribe could feel but not name. The tools of the healer were simple, yet sacred. A carved bone rattle to summon attention, feathers and smoke to cleanse the air, pigments of red ochre, symbolic of life, brushed across the skin of the ill. Each movement was part of a ritual dialogue between the human and the world around them. Healing was an act of connection, not conquest. It reminded the tribe that life itself was fragile and shared. In this union of medicine and mystery, myth was born. The healer's visions became stories, explanations for the unexplainable. The idea of spirits, gods, and ancestors arose from this need to make sense of what the eyes could not see. Death and disease became not just physical realities, but spiritual trials. The healer stood between the two worlds, interpreter and guardian, holding back the chaos that threatened to consume the living. Some entered trances through dance or the beat of drums, others through the smoke of sacred herbs that carried them into visions. These dreamwalkers described journeys through realms of shadow and light, bringing back wisdom that shaped the earliest forms of religion and philosophy. To heal was to dream, to touch the unknown, and return changed. The legacy of these early healers endures. Their herbs became the roots of modern medicine, their rituals became the seeds of faith. In their hands, humanity first learned to comfort its wounds, both seen and unseen. They reminded us that healing is not only about survival, it is about meaning, about finding order in pain, and about recognizing that every cure, every breath, every heartbeat is part of something larger than ourselves. Night fell differently in the ancient world. It was heavier, thicker, and alive with sounds that no fire could fully silence. When the last embers dimmed and the sky turned to ink, early humans faced the oldest test of all: the long, uncertain darkness between sunset and dawn. Out there, beyond the flicker of flame, the world belonged to predators. Lions, leopards, and hyenas moved like shadows, their eyes glinting in the starlight, their breath carried on the wind. For our ancestors, darkness was not just the absence of light, it was the presence of danger. The fear of night was more than emotion. It was evolution, written into the bones. To sleep was to surrender, to let down one's guard in a world that hunted without mercy. Yet sleep was also essential. The body needed rest, the mind needed to dream. So humanity learned to balance vigilance with vulnerability. Families huddled together near firelight, their bodies forming living walls of protection. Fire became their greatest ally, its smoke masking scent, its glow keeping the unseen at bay. In this nightly battle between survival and exhaustion, the human sleep pattern itself was forged. Unlike other animals that slumbered deeply or not at all, humans developed the gift of light sleep, the half-conscious state where awareness never fully vanished. The crack of a twig, the distant growl of a predator, even the soft movement of another's breath could stir them awake. Generations of nights like these shaped the human nervous system, wiring vigilance into every heartbeat. The instinct that once kept our ancestors alive still echoes within us when we wake to every creak in the dark. But fear was not the only companion of night. The fire that burned in the center of the camp did more than protect, it transformed. In its glow, stories were told, songs were sung, and imagination bloomed. The same darkness that hid predators also revealed the stars, vast and endless, stirring questions no daylight could answer. In the silence between the roars of beasts, humanity began to dream not only in sleep, but in thought. The night became both threat and teacher. Predators taught humans the value of unity. No one survived alone in a world where eyes gleamed in the blackness. Watchers took turns guarding the camp. Mothers soothed restless children with whispers. Each dawn was a small victory, proof that cooperation was stronger than claws or fangs. Fear, in its strange way, bound them together. It gave rise to empathy, to community, to the understanding that safety could only be found in one another. Even today, remnants of that primal fear linger. The unease we feel in darkness, the quickened pulse at an unfamiliar sound, all are echoes of those nights on the open plain. Our species was shaped not in sunlight, but in the fragile glow of fire surrounded by endless night. When the flames burned low and danger crept close, humanity learned one of its most important lessons: that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to face it until morning. Long before ink touched paper, before carvings marked stone or symbols etched clay, humanity discovered another way to remember: through voice. In the stillness of the night, beneath the breath of stars and the low hum of the embers, words became the bridge between generations. Around the fires that flickered at the edge of the unknown, storytelling was born. It began as murmurs and memory, but it would become the pulse of human history. Every flame told a story. The way it swayed, the way its light revealed faces and vanished into darkness, mirrored the rhythm of the human voice, rising, falling, glowing, fading. Within those small circles of warmth, the first storytellers spoke of the hunt, of spirits that guided the rain, of ancestors who once walked among the living. These tales were not entertainment, they were survival. They carried warnings about dangerous animals, the change of seasons, or which rivers could kill with a single drink. But as words became woven with emotion, something new began to form: myth. Myth was memory transformed into meaning. It gave purpose to chaos, pattern to mystery. The sun was no longer just a light in the sky, it was a being, reborn each dawn. The storm was not merely weather, but a spirit's anger or blessing. Through story, humans turned nature into narrative, and the world became something they could understand, even if not control. The storytellers were the first historians and philosophers. They held the knowledge of the tribe in their minds, carrying entire generations of wisdom in the folds of memory. Each night they spoke, their voices layered with rhythm and repetition, so that words could be remembered exactly as they were heard. In a time before writing, the human brain became the first library. What could not be recorded was preserved through sound. But stories were more than preservation. They were the glue that held the tribe together. In the telling, listeners found identity. They learned who they were, where they came from, and why their lives mattered. Every child grew up hearing the same tales, inheriting the same lessons. The tribe's moral code, its unspoken laws, was not carved into stone but spoken into existence. Through story, humans learned empathy, courage, and restraint. Over time, storytelling became ceremony. The fire became sacred space, the storyteller a kind of guide between the real and the imagined. Some stories were sung, others whispered, some danced into being beneath the stars. The act of storytelling was itself a ritual, a moment when time slowed and the ordinary became eternal. Even now, echoes of those nights remain. The same instincts that once drew people to the fire now draw us to the glow of screens, the hum of song, the pull of narrative. We still crave meaning, still seek ourselves in story. The voices in the dark never went silent. They evolved, multiplied, and carried us into every new age. In those earliest tales, spoken under open skies, humanity began to write its first unwritten history. The words may have vanished into the wind, but their spirit endures, carried in every language, every myth, every voice that dares to speak into the dark. The story of humanity is the story of movement. Across deserts, mountains, and frozen seas, our ancestors carried not only their bodies, but their hopes, their fears, and their firelight. The Great Migrations were not a single journey but countless waves of exploration that spanned tens of thousands of years, reshaping the face of the earth and everything that lived upon it. From the plains of Africa to the tundras of Europe, from the islands of Southeast Asia to the farthest reaches of the Americas, every step forward rewrote the history of life itself. It began with necessity. Climate shifted, rivers dried, herds vanished. The land that had once sustained them began to change, pushing small bands of humans to wander. They followed the call of survival, guided by instinct and the memory of abundance. With every sunrise, they crossed into new worlds, lands untouched by human presence, where unfamiliar stars guided their nights. The first great exodus from Africa carried humans northward into the Middle East and beyond. There, they encountered other kinds of humans, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, each adapted to their corner of the earth. For a time, they shared the land, sometimes interbreeding, sometimes competing. When the ice thickened and forests turned to frozen plains, humans adapted again. They stitched hides tighter, shaped new tools, and learned to hunt beasts that outweighed them 100-fold. To the east, some followed the curve of coastlines, walking the long ribbon of sand and tide that led to India and Southeast Asia. Others built crude rafts, drifting from island to island until the sea gave way to the vast continent of Australia. There, humans found a world unlike any they had known: kangaroos, giant birds, creatures that had never seen fire or fear of humankind. Within a few thousand years, the arrival of humans had transformed entire ecosystems. The rhythm of nature itself began to change. To the north, humans pressed through the cold corridors of ice into Europe, where they carved homes in caves and left their art on stone. Still others crossed the Siberian plains, reaching the edge of the world, the frozen bridge that once connected Asia to North America. They walked it, step by step, following mammoth herds into a land no human had ever seen. From there they spread southward through the Americas, from Alaska's glaciers to the jungles of the Amazon. It was a journey that spanned millennia, but was carried by a single, relentless truth. Humans are creatures of movement. Each migration reshaped more than the landscape, it reshaped identity. Isolated groups evolved unique languages, traditions, and tools. Skin tones adapted to light, diets changed with climate, and cultures emerged that reflected the diversity of every environment they entered. In moving across the planet, humanity became plural, a single species expressed in 1,000 ways. By the time the migrations slowed, humans had circled the globe. The Earth was no longer a vast wilderness, but a web of footprints, a living map of courage and adaptation. Every mountain crossed, every ocean bridged, was a testament to a simple, unyielding instinct: the need to see what lies beyond the horizon. And though we have filled the world, that instinct remains. Even now, in the age of stars and machines, we are still travelers, still guided by the same ancient pull that carried our ancestors into the unknown, one step at a time. There was a time when humanity lived in balance, a brief golden age before walls, before kingdoms, before the weight of ownership. The hunter-gatherer era, stretching across nearly all of human history, was defined not by conquest or hierarchy but by movement and freedom. For tens of thousands of years, people lived lightly upon the earth, following the rhythm of the seasons and the pulse of the wild. They were not masters of nature, nor its slaves. They were part of its breath. Life in those days was not easy, but it was in harmony. Food was not stored in granaries or guarded behind gates. It was gathered, hunted, and shared. The tribe's strength lay in cooperation, not control. Every person, man, woman, and child, had a role shaped by skill and need rather than status. There were no kings, no property, no wealth to divide them. Leadership was fluid, decisions made through discussion, and power balanced by necessity. The only authority was experience, and the only currency was trust. Their health reflected their way of life. Archaeological remains show that hunter-gatherers were lean, strong, and active. Their diets varied and rich in natural nutrients. They ate what the land offered: roots, fruits, fish, meat, and seeds, seasonal gifts that shifted with the environment. Illness and injury existed, but so did resilience. The constant movement across landscapes prevented waste and disease from festering. Every step, every climb, every pursuit was exercise woven into existence. Their freedom extended beyond the physical. Because they owned little, they carried no burden of excess. Their homes could be built and left behind within a day. When food grew scarce or weather turned hostile, they simply moved on. The world was open, a vast map of possibility. The horizon was not a boundary, but an invitation. Their wealth was knowledge, knowing where the herds would pass, where the berries ripened, when the rains would come. The earth was their teacher, their provider, their only permanent home. But perhaps the most profound quality of this life was equality. In small, mobile bands, cooperation outweighed dominance. Resources were shared, and greed had no soil in which to grow. Both women and men contributed equally to survival, one gathering and mapping the land, the other hunting and defending. The survival of all depended on the contribution of each. In such a world, community was not an idea. It was the foundation of life itself. Their nights were filled with the glow of firelight and the sound of voices rising in laughter, song, and story. Without clocks or calendars, time flowed in rhythm with the earth, marked by migration, harvest, and the stars overhead. It was a life measured not by possession, but by presence. This balance would not last forever. In time, the need for security would outweigh the desire for freedom. Fields would be planted, walls would rise, and the pace of life would change forever. But for a fleeting moment in the deep past, humanity achieved something extraordinary, a way of living that was free, healthy, and connected to the world that made us. It was not paradise, but it was balance. And in that balance, our species found its truest form. The end of the Ice Age was the beginning of everything. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth began to warm. Glaciers melted and rivers swelled, carving new paths through the land. Forests expanded, grasslands bloomed, and the great herds that had once thundered across frozen plains began to thin. For the first time in human memory, abundance was no longer guaranteed. The climate that had shaped our wandering ancestors was changing, and with it, so too would the rhythm of human life. As the seasons grew more predictable, some groups stopped chasing herds and began to linger near fertile valleys and lakes. They noticed something subtle yet profound. Seeds left in the ground sometimes grew back. Grains like wheat, barley, and millet sprouted where old camps had been abandoned. The discovery was not a revelation, but a slow realization, a quiet understanding that the land could be persuaded to give more, not just once, but again and again. It was here, in these gentle experiments, that the wild world and the human will first collided. To plant a seed was to take a risk, an act of patience and defiance. For millions of years, survival had meant movement. Now, it meant waiting. The hunter became a sower, the gatherer, a caretaker. In that waiting came the birth of a new relationship with the earth, one that was both nurturing and possessive. Humanity was beginning to trade freedom for certainty. Villages began to rise along the fertile crescent of the Middle East, in river valleys fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile. Families built homes from clay and reed, their walls holding warmth through the night. The first granaries appeared, structures built to store surplus, to prepare for seasons ahead. With storage came stability, and with stability came change. The days of wandering across open landscapes were ending. The domestication of plants was followed by the taming of animals. Goats, sheep, and cattle no longer fled from the human presence. They followed it. A new kind of partnership emerged, one that tied humans to the soil and to the creatures that shared their labor. Fields replaced the wilderness, and with each harvest, the bond deepened. But the gift of agriculture carried a hidden price. Diets narrowed. The variety of wild foods gave way to dependence on a few crops. Diseases spread easily in crowded settlements. The egalitarian bonds of the hunter-gatherer world began to strain as ownership and surplus introduced new hierarchies. The same fields that fed the people also rooted them to one place, turning movement into memory. Yet from this transformation would come civilization itself. The first villages would become cities. The storage of food would become trade, and trade would become wealth. Walls would rise, temples would follow, and humanity would begin to shape the earth on a scale never seen before. It began quietly, with a single seed pressed into the soil. That moment, small, patient, and deliberate, was the first step toward everything that would follow. In choosing to stay, humanity rewrote its destiny. The wild world had once shaped us. Now we had learned to shape it. But in that triumph lay the question that still lingers today. What did we lose when we stopped moving and began to plant? Beneath the hum of cities and the glow of neon, beneath the pulse of traffic and the rhythm of digital lives, the ancient heartbeat of the hunter-gatherer still echoes. It lives within our instincts, our desires, and the quiet corners of our dreams. Though skyscrapers rise where grass once grew and we scroll instead of wander, the human mind has never fully left the wild. Every heartbeat still remembers the pulse of the plains. Every breath still carries the rhythm of wind through trees. The modern world tries to drown it out, but the echoes are there in the urge to explore, to seek, to move toward the unknown. When we climb mountains or walk along the ocean, something ancient stirs. It is the memory of migration, of following horizons not for conquest or wealth, but for the simple need to see what lay beyond. The restlessness we call ambition was once survival. The curiosity that built civilizations began as the instinct to adapt. We are, at our core, wanderers who learned to build instead of move. Even our fears are relics of that earlier world. The quickened heartbeat at a sound in the dark, the uneasy feeling of being watched, the instinct to gather close to others, these are whispers from an age when the night was full of predators and survival meant vigilance. The same pulse that once listened for the growl of lions now listens for notifications and alarms, but the wiring is the same. The ancient vigilance that once saved us from danger has become the hum of anxiety in a world too crowded to rest. And yet, the gifts of that age endure too. The creativity that turned stone into tool, that shaped fire into story, still drives us. Our empathy, born around the communal hearth, continues to bind us in unseen ways. We share, collaborate, dream, and imagine, because those were the skills that once ensured our survival. The social ties that connect humanity across continents are the direct descendants of the campfire circle. Modern life may have changed our surroundings, but it has not rewritten our nature. When we find solace in the wilderness, when we crave silence after days of noise, we are returning to ourselves. We are answering a call older than civilization. The need to reconnect with the earth, to breathe air unshaped by walls, is not nostalgia, it is memory. Our blood remembers rivers and rain, the scent of soil, the language of stars. The story of the hunter-gatherer did not end with the dawn of agriculture. It lives on in our restless hearts and curious minds. The same spark that once lit the first fire now glows in every idea, every journey, every act of creation. We are the children of movement, of balance, of imagination, and though we have built a world of glass and steel, the wilderness still lives inside us. It whispers when we dream. It calls when we wander. It reminds us that beneath the layers of history and progress, we are still of the earth, still guided by the same ancient rhythm that began when our ancestors first looked to the horizon and took that first, uncertain step into forever.